We will now start with the Board of, excuse me, Board of Inquiry. We'll start with Dr. Lauren Groff.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the panel. First question I'll ask to both Mr. Abbott and Mr. Weiss, but I'd also be interested to hear from Mr. Green and Mr. Hickerson. This morning and actually throughout the day, we've heard of the variety of challenges of infrastructure and supporting systems, communications, things like that aviation in Alaska face. And it's also been pointed out to us that it goes even beyond the availability of internet and de-icing services, but in some locations there's no building, there's nothing there to support the pilot. So one of the things that we heard in this panel was an intent to adapt SMS or to voluntarily join the SMS program. I know that system was born out of the scheduled commercial aviation world. Is it feasible to adapt SMS to aviation in Alaska, and how do you think that might go? Any changes that might be necessary to adapt sort of the FAA model of SMS to Alaska?
No, that's a good question, and I think that really all it would take would be to change the applicability of Part 5, okay, to require actually you could require scheduled air carriers and air tour operators to have an SMS, and I believe in the human performance report there was a safety recommendation from the Transportation Board to have SMS for all Part 135 carriers, and I believe that's I believe that's a must, because number one, you identify the hazards, you run through a risk management program, and you appropriately mitigate those risks. So no, I would if I was king for a day, that would be my one wish. In addition to all the infrastructure things that we're talking about, because I think pilots need to be able to make good decisions. They need to they make those good decisions based on data. And data means they got to have good weather. They got to have weather reporting points to be able to make those decisions. So I think, yeah, from my perspective, no, I would agree with that.
Any additional comment that anyone would like to add to that?
I'd say on the SMS piece, the SMS recognizes the hazards that are out there. The building or lack of a building, then that would be addressed through the SMS. You look at, okay, that's a problem. How would we fix it? What would we do to make that problem go away? So I think 135 scheduled SMS. And there's not very many of them out there either. We're going to have to learn as we go through that. But I see no reason that model can't be applied to a 135 scheduled.
Yeah, I would agree. In the environment that we operate up here, we have additional hazards. We have less infrastructure. We have just across the board, communication, weather reporting, those types of things. And the SMS process is that closed loop process, allows you to identify those, assess them, manage them, and then monitor them to make sure that those barriers or those mitigations that you put in place are effective. So, I think integrating those processes into our company in the environment that we operate are actually absolutely critical.
Thank you. And I want to make a distinction between sort of a required SMS program that 121 now has in the formal voluntary program option for 135, and I think that's really what we were talking about, is that so if an operator such as Hagelin has stated their intent, wants to participate in FAA's formal SMS voluntary program, how do they go about submitting an SMS implementation plan to the FAA to make that happen?
Okay, so it essentially starts out with a letter of intent, and the reason for the letter of intent, in simple terms, is that we, FAA, don't spend a lot of man hours on someone who's not actually committed. And so the letter of intent says, yes, we are committed both intellectually, philosophically, financially to doing this. The next piece, which is we, the inspectors in Alaska, we don't have SMS expertise. So we bring in the FAA SMS office who does have that expertise. And they will absolutely work with the principal inspectors, with me and the certificate holder to bring us forward in SMS. It will be a big learning experience for FAA. It'll be a learning experience for Hagelin. I think it'll ultimately be a model for what a large 135 SMS looks like in the country.
Thank you. And so once the Part 135 operators voluntary SMS would gain an acceptance, you said you'd bring in the experts, presumably from other areas within the FAA, but it would still then eventually revert back to the oversight would be local in a sense, right? So how would the oversight of the voluntary program be performed then? Do you anticipate that it would be similar to the FAA's current oversight of the required 121 SMS
Okay,
programs?
I would. I mean, I would anticipate it would look the same. That piece, what we're doing with 135 voluntary SMS is pretty unusual. And so we will have to work with the SMS office, the FAA SMS office, and help the CMT develop the right kind of questions to go into the safety assurance system that we initially talked about, because that's the system we use. Ultimately, we'd have to figure out a way, how does all that look so that the inspectors can verify that the SMS is doing what it's designed to do.
Deke, if I could add,
Yes,
add to
please
that.
do.
Yeah. The principal inspectors are an integral part of the SMS process. So you just can't have the operator develop an SMS and then not have our principals involved. It doesn't. So the expertise and skill, gets built along as the company's developing their SMS and with the interaction with the principals.
So if, to go back to something that Mr. Rock mentioned earlier, if a Part 135 operator decided that it wanted to use its medallion manuals or parts of that procedures as part of its safety risk management component of an accepted SMS program, would compliance with those manuals and procedures then also be subject to oversight?
Okay. I'm going to say the answer to that's no. If it's inside a medallion program, we do not oversight in any shape or form medallion programs. If they wanted to have an SMS, that would be, ultimately it has to be accepted by the CMT. So we would accept that, and that would be therefore in a document, a manual that we would look at. What they would have on the medallion side would not be something we would look at.
So if I want to make sure I'm understanding your answer, then those elements being added to their manual, those would just be, no matter where they came from, they would just be elements added to the manual, and they would no longer be, the oversight would not be of the medallion, but it would be those elements as they were added to the manual?
Yeah, right. So I'm going to be specific with the language. They would be, subjected to the FAA accepted manual versus a medallion document. So an FAA accepted manual, that is where we would look. That's what we would do the inspections and the audits against. We would not go and look at what medallion had. Ideally, we would simply have everything simply be in just the FAA accepted documents and stop right there. And then if medallion wanted to audit against that, that would be up to them how they work that. But for us, we do not touch, look at, deal with in any shape or form the medallion manuals. We do, because they're not FAA approved or accepted.
Okay, thank you.
Can I just,
Yes,
I thought I
please
heard
do.
a different question there, so I just want to make sure for clarity's sake. So you're talking about, regardless of what manual and how it was developed, if they're utilizing it as part of their SMS, is that the question you were asking?
Yes, if they were
How would
to-
we look at it
right,
then?
if they would include
Okay,
it.
all right, good. So under SMS, the carrier has the ultimate responsibility to ensure compliance with the rules and safe operations and conducting risk management. So whatever program they use in that, for us, we would do the safety assurance piece to make sure the output of that is reaching the desired goal of the company, okay? So yeah, I would think that's, in that regard, that would be how you would integrate policy and procedures from into your program from let's say, a medallion.
Okay, so in that case, if they were to include that as part of, that is included in the FAA's acceptance of their SMS program, it would be their adherence to those elements of the medallion manual would be what the FAA would be overseeing.
Yeah, because we would be looking at the output
Right.
of their system at that point there, and keep in mind too, we would probably have different or custom DCTs to develop to do the data collection piece of it. So yeah, no, I think we would look at it.
Okay, thank you for the clarification. I'll pass it on my time.
Mr. DeLisi?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Green, you mentioned once again the FOQA program that's being installed, the equipment being installed at Hagelin. I can't sing the praises loudly enough for that decision. I think it's a brilliant one. A little background, the board recently concluded the investigation of a 9-fatal Part 135 accident in Akron, Ohio. ExecuFlight was the operator. They were flying a Hawker, and the airplane was required to have a CVR but no FDR, and there was no flight data monitoring capability. So to do our investigation, we had to take the radar hits and do a full performance study to try to figure out how this airplane was being flown. And what we found was shocking. First of all, it was in violation of the FARs, exceeding 250 knots below 10K. They set up an unstable approach with a sink rate of over 2,500 feet per minute, less than 1,000 feet above the ground. Full flaps were deployed long before they broke out of the clouds and saw the ground. They busted minimums. Yet what was most disconcerting about all of that was the cockpit conversation between the two crew members made it seem as if nothing was unusual. It seemed like the way they flew that airplane every day. And why not? No one would ever know. Without any flight data monitoring, there's no insight to see whether your standard operating procedures are being followed, how the crews are actually flying the airplane. So we made a recommendation to the FAA, which I thought was kind of groundbreaking. It was not for the requirement to put a flight data recorder on the airplane that would have made our job easier in the event of an accident. No, it was to put a low-cost flight data monitoring recorder, to require one on all Part 135 operations. The FAA's initial response was a big fat no. They don't see the way clear to ever requiring a regulation for a flight data monitoring capability on a 135 operation. But I think, as we've talked about today, it is so key to safety for pilots to know that the way they're flying the airplane can be monitored in some level, de-identified, aggregated, trend monitoring. That's maybe the way to make sure that pilots who are faced with that individual private decision that day on how to fly that airplane, if they know in the back of their heads that someone can keep tabs on how they're doing, that may really help shift the culture. So I thank you for that corporate decision. Along those lines, to our medallion friends, any aspect of the medallion star audit points, does any one of them look at whether or not an operator has a flight data monitoring program?
I'll answer that. No, we don't. We can put, we've got in like operational control, maintenance, nothing that specifically drives to some sort of avenue in which to gather information.
Is that something you might consider in the future?
I don't see why we wouldn't.
I think we might come out very strongly in suggesting that that might be a key. And I think it just would be so cool that in order for you to have your medallion shield, you had to be engaged in some sort of flight data monitoring. So I appreciate that you might give that some thought in the future. Ms. Walker, you talked about certain entities being members of the Medallion Foundation versus others that are star holders and perhaps some that have the full shield. Do you have any sort of a breakdown for the population that fits in those categories?
So everyone who joins Medallion, it's a voluntary organization. They pay a membership. I believe the numbers are we've got 56 members. Participating members are those who are either already hold a star or have the shield or multiple stars, or that they are actively working toward a goal to achieve their first star.
Okay.
And I think those numbers are probably 40, 42. And like I said in the briefing I gave earlier, that we do have a number of members who take our tools, they embed pieces of them into their system, but they're not actively working with a program manager to move forward. They like where they're at, they like the tools they have. Sometimes it's their resources that they have that they can't have a person dedicated to promoting, documenting, building, actively participating and managing any of the programs. You know, these small 135 operators, you've got the head of the organization who's also a pilot. You know, he's the managing pilot is what he
Understand.
is. So
Thank you. Mr. Green, does Hagelin provide any confidential information to the Medallion Foundation?
Well, we, as we go through our internal audit process, we do have the standard, the checklists that we use to do our internal audit, and I believe that the Medallion Foundation purges those after 6 months. I don't know if you would consider that.
Well, I was asking
confidential
whether
information.
Hagelin considers any information that they provide to Medallion to be company confidential information.
I mean, safety information by nature can be confidential. I mean, when you're doing critical analysis of yourself, it's nice to know that you can throw spitballs up on the wall without that coming back to haunt you, right? But I can't think of any specific confidential information that we share
So-
with them.
Thanks. So, Ms. Walker, when you talked about the need for the Medallion Foundation to be very protective of the confidential information that operators provide you, what sort of information is that?
So they don't provide us or necessarily hand over safety reports. Through our audits and through the review process as the program manager, we're exposed to a lot of confidential information, whether it's the way they've designed their program, whether it's information coming through their safety reporting system, whether it's documentation that they've developed to support their safety committees and the output of the safety committees, their SRAs. That's all confidential to that operator. We see it, observe it, say, this looks great, their corrective action plans, and that's where we leave it at.
Yeah.
Sure, I understand that you might see that information and you probably have a confidentiality agreement that you execute with your members. But are you provided that information? Do you take
Are we-
ownership of confidential information?
No, we don't. There is the ASAP program that we facilitate. We're the administrator for the ASAP MOU for the carriers across the state, but we don't own that information,
Okay.
if that's what you're
Yep.
getting at. Okay.
Mr. Hickerson, when Hagelin set out to gain the CFIT star from the Medallion Foundation, did you have to do anything different, or was it that whatever you were already doing met the requirements for the star?
And I'm going to have to reach back quite a ways. The CFIT star was gained in 2005. I was a line pilot for a year or two.
Gotcha.
So I'm not completely familiar with exactly what the company had to do from their normal practices to what they did to gain that star.
All right. Mr. Weiss or Abbott, when you talk about overseeing the Hagelin certificate, aren't there a number of different names that operators use that are flying under the Hagelin certificate? Raven, ERA, are those entities all part of the Hagelin certificate?
No, the Hagelin, so that's a misnomer. They have multiple operations under one corporation, but we only oversee the 135 Hagelin certificate. They have another certificate, which is a 121, but my office does not have anything to do with them. We only oversee the 135 certificate.
Okay. Mr. Green or Hickerson, I'm sorry, maybe there was a better person to have asked this question, but I'm trying to get the lay of the land. When we talk about Haglund, are there multiple 135 carriers?
No, it is a single 135 carrier certificate. There's a parent company that owns two certificates, a 121 and a 135 that are exercised independently of each other.
So what is Raven?
Raven is the business name.
It's the business name?
The parent company.
Gotcha. And is ERA a name that still exists anymore?
That is not.
Okay. Gotcha. Helicopters. One final question, and Mr. Rock, I'll steer this to you. We have investigated accidents for a number of operators that have participated in audit programs. The IOSA program is BAO. Folks have Wyvern audits, Argus audits. The TOPS program has some audit standards. We sometimes hear people say that safety is what takes place in the cockpit, that an audit program just creates the illusion of safety. The paperwork is there for safety. How would you react to this concept that an audit program just gives you the illusion of safety?
Well, in our program, you can't join the program until the owner of that company sits down and talks with me, and we see a commitment that the management believes in safety and is going to provide the assets, the people, from a top to the bottom down look. So, you know, in our case, when we go in and do an audit, especially with shield carrier, that's probably a 24-hour audit. We go during the day and then we go at night, and we meet with the ground people at night during the day. But part of the culture part that we look at is we sit down with probably 20% of the employees, depending on the size of the carrier, and go through and make sure that they understand the reporting process for any kind of safety hazards that they have. We look at the culture as far as, do they understand their entire safety program, and do they understand management's view of the safety program. So we want to know that they're being taught from the top down that the safety program's embedded within their operation.
Great. Thank you all very much.
A question for Mr. Weiss. You indicated that in the improvement of the crash rates in Alaska are proof of the medallion's effectiveness. But were there other safety programs and safety advocates going on at that same time?
Yeah, what I actually said was that you know, it's a combination of, or what I meant to say was, it was a combination of all these different programs that are going on: Capstone, Medallion, weather cameras. Every one of them has is part of a safety chain that we have, if you would. And you, if you change that in any way, you may impact the reduction in accidents that we have. So but Medallion is part of that accident reduction.
Have you worked to try to segregate some of the effects so that you understand the effectiveness of one program versus another? You
know, that's a good point, because I wrote down here early on, I think it was Dr. Wilson up there was talking about or somebody mentioned the cultural change. How do you measure, and really how do you measure the effectiveness of cultural change, you know, or behavior, you know, of a carrier? And that's a challenge. It's easy to measure how a piece of equipment impacts something. But it's a little more difficult to measure the change and behavior of an individual or a company or such that we have to continually look at their performance. I mean, it's easy to see with Haglund, you know, over the past 3 years, the change in behavior of the management, the change in behavior of the pilots. However, the individual out there, that's the one thing that all carriers, including Haglund, need to be able to trap, is that that pilot culture that Mr. Abbott was talking about, that doesn't follow the rules, so I would think that, and so that's it's a carrier's responsibility to have systems in place that trap that behavior. So, and that's a challenge to do that. I mean, if you could give me Dr. Wilson for a few months, I'm sure we could probably come up with a way to do that. But we need to assess that.
So the answer is it's difficult.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. In the 121 world, in the lower 48, well, not entirely, the same forcing function back in the late 90s that drove the creation of Medallion also drove the creation of CAST, Commercial Aviation Safety Team.
Mm-hmm.
Now, it uses a very different model than what you have here. I'm just wondering if you've looked at the effectiveness of doing a CAST-like model where you get government, industry, pilots, the safety community, all working collaboratively, but in particular, working with the data to find out where your worst problems are and work on those first, and then move to identify what the effects were and see what your measurable outcomes are so that you, in fact, are doing things that are effective. Have you considered some sort of manifestation of that kind of model?
Well, I think the first half of that model, we work collaboratively here within the region, using the data, kind of a data-informed approach or data-driven approach to identifying the high-risk areas that we need to deal with, I think is an avenue we need to look at.
Because you got pieces of this that are starting to form. I presume WBAT is a confidential reporting system. You also mentioned ASAP, and both of those are one of the data sources that go into a SIAS, which is really the basis for the data residence in CAST. FOQA is another big part of that. But having all of that data doesn't do you any good until you really understand what's in the data. And what's in the data only comes out when you come up with the right questions to ask the data. In fact, Mr. Abbott, you made the comment that Alaska Air Operations are capable of achieving the same level of safety as in the lower 48, producing the same improvements in fatal and serious accident rates as any other state. And I'm just curious what your thoughts about why that doesn't seem to have happened.
I believe deep down it's a function of this long-term culture that exists in the pilot community, not just commercial pilot community, but also the private pilot. Maybe it might not be private pilots as a certificate, but pilots not for hire, where it's a different attitude towards compliance with the rules. And I believe it goes back to, it's my own personal belief, that it goes back historically, 100 years ago, and now what you have is this has moved forward to where we are today, where people are willing to take risks that they wouldn't take anywhere else, based on historically, this is how I've seen these people do it, and generations prior, and now we are here where we are today. And I think we've finally gotten to a place where it's being recognized that's not such a good thing. Just because you can get there is not necessarily good, because you took an unnecessary risk to make that happen.
So basically what you're saying is it's a culture change, and culture changes occur slowly.
Oh, I think it's absolutely. I mean, I think what we're trying to turn a 100-year culture. That's what I believe. I think we're trying to turn a 100-year culture and get it in line with the rest of the country to help get us where we are today, or where we need to go away from where we are today. It's very difficult. It's the comments and the the questions that we get asked as inspectors they show that that's still out there. I know those blogs, I put those blogs in for a reason in the presentation, because it showed this is kind of what's sitting out there, the joy of bush flying. This is flying is joyful. I've been doing it a long time, but this is a job. This is a profession, and professions have discipline and rules. And the joy piece of it is really not relevant. And we need to pull that out and have folks recognize this is a business, and people put their trust in you when they get in the airplane. And that's a culture change.
Thank you. Do we have another round for the Board of Inquiry?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Question for either Mr. Rock or Ms. Walker, both. Given your orientation in the industry where it is voluntary participation and you do get to see sort of the inside workings of an operator as part of the audit program, is there any capability of comparing or giving an individual operator information about how they compare to the whole? Say, for example, do you compile any information, aggregated, de-identified information about how all of the other audits have gone so that you can give some feedback to an individual operator without identifying any other carriers except the one you're auditing at the moment, if that makes sense?
It does make sense, and if you don't mind, Jerry, I'll answer this. It makes sense. We do not aggregate any of the findings or any of the concerns or any of the issues that commonly crop up during the audits or any of the pre-audit activities. A lot of times they're pretty typical. Things aren't signed off as they should be, or, the amount of hours weren't accounted for on 2 or 3 records. Where we do accumulate data and present it back to the industry that are participating is through ASAP. So once a year, we have a meeting with the FAA, with our participating ASAP members, and the data that we've finally started gathering since inception of this ASAP MOU among the carriers is now starting to add some value back to the carriers. So now we can see some numbers that can demonstrate that there's maybe ATC issues. I don't remember what some of our numbers off the top of my head. I don't manage that program. We can see where there's maybe a heightened reporting of weather issues or checklist issues or pre-flight planning issues that are occurring. Or a typical one that came out a couple of years ago was the number of instances the tail stand had been left in place by the carriers who had tail stands on either the Beech 1900 or on the Caravan. And we announced, I remember Kent did it, I think he sent out even a notice to the carriers saying, hey, we've seen this increase in this last year of this occurring. We suggest that all the carriers participating implement some sort of program that's going to reduce the number of these reports.
Can I answer
Yes.
that, Dr. Groff? The Medallion program was built off the sharing ideas. Alaska Airlines was a big supporter of that. And we still do that today. When we see trends or we see someone, our program manager sees someone doing something a better way, we always share that information. And really, ASAP has been a tremendous change in Alaska. I've been in aviation in Alaska for probably 38 years, and we've had the ASAP program. It was a pilot project. Started in 2005, and to date, probably as we've trended it, 93% of the reports would have never been known about by the FAA if we did not have the ASAP program. And the other big number, and kind of growing up in aviation in Alaska, is nobody ever wanted to make any changes to their maintenance or their ops manuals. It was almost like forbidden not to touch them. And since the beginning of ASAP, we now see we have solid numbers of normally about a 64% change in the Ops and maintenance manuals just off ASAP reports.
So thank you, and I think that's actually sort of the basis of the question. We've heard a lot of questions about effectiveness and monitoring effectiveness and actually having measurable information about effectiveness. These are knowable answers to questions. So I think that's an example of implementing that. So the reason for my question. Real quick. Mr. Weiss, just wanted to clarify, you made a statement about the carrier's responsibility regarding safety culture. Would you say that the decisions and actions of an individual or an employee of an operator would be indicative of the safety culture of that operation? Okay, thank you. And one final question that I had, I know Mr. Rock mentioned some of the trends they see are things like pilots getting very little training, having low experience, having no plans for turnaround. Today we heard a discussion of the OCC program at Hagelin that is unique. We heard a variety of things that have been put in place, yet in this case the accident pilot was by all accounts not low experience, had training, had experience, had a plan to turn around, and yet we still had an accident. I just open up to the panel if you have any ideas of how you would explain that.
You know, we try to provide human factors training every year, and you know, we struggle to get the right people in those classes. And you know, if we could provide that to all the pilots, maybe we could get them to start thinking about that. You know, I pretty much start every safety meeting that, and probably in a couple of my newsletters, that there's absolutely no reason to have a CFIT accident ever, because if you follow the regulations and you follow the operators operating GOM, you'll never have a CFIT accident.
I would echo that as well. Message has been clear from our top management, myself included. Any pilot that operates inside the GOM, we can defend all day long. Take one step outside the GOM or outside the regulations, and they're completely on their own, making decisions not supported by the company, the industry, or the FAA. That's something that we're spending a lot of time in trying to capture to make sure that's what each and every one of our pilots are doing.
Yeah, and I would add that just because that individual is a high-time pilot doesn't mean necessarily they have a low risk tolerance, right? So it's our responsibility as a company to own that risk, to build the box, to ensure that our pilots are flying inside that box, and then to double down on the safety culture to make sure that pilots understand what the expectation is, and that we expect them to be professional pilots and comply with all our procedures.
No further questions.
I'd like, did you want to add something, Dee?
Go ahead, Clint.
Yeah, I think it kind of goes to looking at the depth of background or the background of the pilot you're about in your hiring practices. The interesting thing about both the St. Mary's accident and the Togiak accident, both pilots had quite similar backgrounds, came from a similar operator, and they were all highly experienced. They all were flying IFR-equipped aircraft. They were all flying in underlying IFR airspace, which they could have picked up a clearance. The interesting thing about the Togiak accident, and I think the thing that carriers, or carrier like Hagelin or Hagelin needs to really look at and duplicate, is the pilot that deviated to the south and west, and figure out why that pilot did what that, and duplicate that throughout their organization, because that was the right decision to make that day. I mean, there's a lot of pressures, sometimes self-induced pressures, that people put on themselves to operate aircraft. And I was thinking as they were talking about that deviation, I was thinking about when my 121 days flying down south, you're on an arrival somewhere, or you're having to deviate around weather. I mean, you might fly 500 miles just to deviate around weather, but at the end of the day, some of those deviations don't add that much more to your flight time or overall operation, because everybody, the cost, the benefit to the people on board the aircraft, everybody gets there safely in one piece. So that's the key, is to duplicate that behavior and figure out what that is. Go ahead, Dee.
I mean, you're kind of asking the ultimate question, right? I mean, that's the question. Why did that pilot make that choice? I don't know. I mean, I think at some point, we have to say that if you want to be in this profession, then the rules have a reason. Almost all the rules were written because of something bad that's happened. And if you want to be in this profession, this is the behavior that you must display on everything. And it's not just the airplane. It's every part of their professional demeanor has to be looked at and say, use speeding tickets. There's all sorts of measurements there. Are you willing to say at 2 o'clock in the morning at the red light, do I stop? Yes. And that's what we have to find. I don't have the magic answer, but I do know that's a piece that we have to look at.
In wrap up, do we have a few comments from the tech panel?
Yes, sir. The technical panel has a couple more questions we'd like to ask for 5 minutes, if that's okay.
Go ahead.
Mr. Weiss, I understand your explanation that in your opinion, Medallion must have been effective, but at the same time it's difficult to separate the Medallion Foundation from other advances that have taken place over the same time frame. Can you explain within the context of the goals and objectives written into the contracts or cooperative agreements governing this grant relationship, what specifically measurable performance outcome data the FAA has collected from Medallion over the past 15 years?
I'd have to get back to you on that, okay? And I tell you why. I mean, I can anecdotally tell you, based on my experience as an aviation safety inspector in Alaska, watching Medallion work with carriers, there's how they've been effective in turning around carriers and how they've been effective at not turning around carriers. It's been the carrier's decision in each case. Yeah, I don't think we grab that kind of data.
Okay, but they feel that's something you could probably be able to provide? You said you'd be able to get back to me. Do you think you could?
I mean, I'll tell you what I'll promise to do. I'll promise to take a look at it and see if we have the data available to get back, because it just might not be there.
And my last question, Mr. Rock, you indicated after an audit you give corrective actions and follow-ups to the participant or the carrier. How long do you maintain these audit records for each carrier you work with?
The audits that we do with the carrier, the audit sheets, they keep those. We don't keep the audit sheets. Those are internal to carrier. We go in and just audit off our sheets, and that's it. We keep the latest report on whether they passed the audit or whether they failed an audit.
Okay.
And at the next audit, we change out that. We keep it on file.
Thank you. Dr. Wilson?
I have no questions.
Mr. Franz?
Thank you. I have a couple of follow-ups. For Mr. Green, I want to circle back to just specifically actions that Hagelin is taking in lieu of this accident. And one of your slides in your presentation was a compilation of the 7-point agreement. It was similar, but not exactly matching to the 7-point agreement that I showed that came out, I believe, in January of this year. But there are 3 points on there I wanted to ask you about, steps that Hagelin has committed to taking and where they're at. The first one was the VFR routes. The 7-point agreement that I showed stated that Hagelin, let me just read it here. Hagelin's committed to fully implementing GPS VFR routes for all flights. And I understand that that's further qualified by the fact that Hagelin has, in this note, 7,600 possible city pairs, so that's a lot of designated GPS routes, and it would be a significant undertaking. But I'm just not clear, is that commitment still in place? Is Hagelin still dedicated to developing designated GPS routes for all flying day and night?
So we are committed to developing a comprehensive solution to this issue. As we went through our SRA process, we identified some unintended consequences as we analyzed that commitment. As a result of that, we are in the process, in conjunction with the CMT and with the FAA, of developing a solution that manages this issue to the highest level of safety.
The second point I wanted to ask you about was in the 7-point agreement. I'll read it again. Hagelin currently has 213 non-GPS night routes with altitudes in their op specs. Hagelin will immediately begin flying these routes utilizing GPS guidance both day and night when VFR conditions are present. Is Hagelin currently flying the routes that are contained in OPSPEC 050 that are B050 that are specified for night flying? Are they currently flying those routes during the day as well?
Yeah, it'd probably be better for the DO to answer that.
Under certain conditions, again, yes. What we weren't going to do is put ourselves at more risk if we determined that would do that. So under certain conditions, yes, that is an accurate statement.
All right, thanks. And the last one was the point 7 from the agreement. Hagelin agreed they're committed to operating all flights with GPS operative, and that intent, or I guess the intent would you would remove it from your MEL. You wouldn't be able to fly without it. Now I understand that you've modified that to Hagelin flights are able to operate without a GPS with management level approval. Why the change?
I did notice on the slide that was brought up as part of this hearing that it did not marry up with the one that we had. I don't know, the verbiage that we had was from a January 10 letter. Is that the same letter?
It's not a letter. It's the I could tell you it's one of the exhibits, and the exhibit is titled 7-Point Agreement FAA and between the FAA and Hagelin. And it's the one, the 7th point is that you would fly all flights with GPS, and now I believe, my understanding is now you are authorizing flights to go without the GPS operative with certain levels of approval. And
Correct.
So why that change?
Well, the letter here that is from the FAA, dated January 10, our final agreement was that flights without an operable GPS will be elevated to a risk 3 on the current risk assessment worksheet, which specifically requires management approval. So the reason for that is, some of the routes that we have, you can, as soon as you lift off, you can see the destination where you're going. Obviously, those are very specific situations, and we want to control those situations, but there are unique situations, and I'm sure Lou could further amplify those that we didn't want to lose the capability of using.
This also did not address IFR flying. So there are routes that do not require GPSs or GPS capabilities to be conducted solely under IFR. And under that current agreement, that did not say VFR or IFR. So it had to be adjusted accordingly.
Okay, thank you. My time is up. Thank you,
I could add one more if you don't mind on that.
Please.
That came about when we initially had the conversation. It was we needed lateral guidance We needed vertical guidance, we needed altitudes. And so that went in the initial language. The GPS therefore would not be deferrable. So in the absence of a GPS, the airplane only has one way to get home. We're at two. You can fix it there or you can ferry it home, but it would not be a revenue trip. After that agreement, we sat down, Luke, myself, a couple other folks, and they brought up a couple scenarios which made a lot of sense. Some of them were so close that literally by the time you took off, you were on the base to land at the other airport. So did we really have to have a GPS for such an incredibly short leg event? And that made sense, and so that's why that language changed. It's for very specific, I hate to, these guys tease me when I use city pairs, but that city pair piece is so short, that leg, a GPS didn't need that, and that was the reason for that change.
All right, thank you, Mr. Abbott. That's all I have. Thank you. Mr. Williams?
I'd like to circle back around to Mr. Williams' question, if that's all possible.
A short,
Yeah, real short. You may remember when you were inspector, we had the air carrier risk assessment tool. Thinking about it, we may be able to take that data and compare risk of peer group like carriers to see medallion carriers versus non-medallion carriers, and then compare that against Medallion's quarterly reports for all the other activity that they do to kind of see, measure their effectiveness that way. So we'll take a look at it from that perspective.
Thank you.
okay, this concludes questions for panel 3. Mr. Williams, are there action items from this session?
Yes, sir. From the Medallion Foundation, we'd like to request that NIOSH list that you offered up to us. Thank you, sir. From the FAA, Mr. Weiss, like you just spoke about, as far as any measurable data for the grant agreement. And from Hagelin, we'd like to request that copy of the updated letter of agreement between Hagelin and the FAA.
Okay, thank you. So all of the witnesses have now testified. So this hearing on the NTSB investigation into the October 2nd, 2016 accident involving Hagelin Aviation Services Flight 3153 is now concluded. The record will remain open for additional materials requested during the hearing. On behalf of my fellow board members and the NTSB staff, we extend our appreciation to the participants at this hearing. My thanks to each of the witnesses for their testimony. Also, thank you to the parties and party spokespersons for your cooperation, not only at this hearing, but throughout the investigation. I also want to thank all of those here in Anchorage and the larger Alaskan community for their cooperation and support. Finally, I'd like to acknowledge the NTSB investigators, legal staff, Office of Communication, and others from throughout the agency who worked hard to support this hearing. The transcript is scheduled to be available within 7 days of completion of the hearing and will be made available to the parties and witnesses electronically. Any corrections to the transcript by witnesses or parties should be sent to the hearing officer, Sean Williams, within 30 days, and that's September 18, 2017. Any documents or information identified during the hearing that a party agrees to furnish to the NTSB should also be sent to the hearing officer within 30 days. Again, that's September 18th, 2017. The archive of the hearing webcast will remain on the NTSB website for several months after the hearing. The transcript of the hearing and all materials entered into the record will become part of the public docket, along with other records of the investigation. Today, we've heard valuable information about air operations, oversight, safety culture, and decision-making processes affecting Hagelin Flight 3153. We've gained a greater understanding of the facts and circumstances surrounding this tragic accident. Our investigation is ongoing, and we'll continue to work diligently to finalize our report. We hope that this hearing and our subsequent final report will provide critical information to the parties involved, oversight agencies, air carriers, and the flying community of Alaska. We stand adjourned.